He broke a billionaire's hand just for touching my waist. I was passing champagne at an elite underground party when a drunk guest got too handsy. In seconds, my cold, untouchable boss stepped in, his eyes full of lethal fury. He snapped the guy's bones, pulled me aside, and whispered, "You're the only clean thing in my life, and I will burn this entire house down before I let anyone taint that." On Grace Moore, 2:47 in the morning, and the subject wakes in a state of acute panic. Her mind fixates on a singular obsession: an envelope, a passport, keys, and documents. Cole Viscari, a textbook megalomaniacal narcissist, ordered her to leave them in his quarters. Grace knows his midnight meetings involve armed men and hushed Italian negotiations. In just 14 days, she has already adopted the survival mechanics of a captive: do not ask, do not assume, and never fail the captor. She leaps from her bed, abandoning basic self-preservation. She wears a naive red and white nightgown, a symbol of her sheltered past. The lesson here is simple. When fear dictates your actions, you lose your sense of self long before you realize it is gone. The physical environment plays a crucial role in psychological isolation. Grace moves through the dark, silent mansion, terrified even to look at the expensive art. Her bare feet on the cold marble underscore her extreme vulnerability. She approaches Viscari private territory in the East Wing, a restricted zone. She rationalizes her intrusion as an emergency, a classic cognitive distortion to manage her anxiety. The door is unlocked. To her untrained mind, this is merely surprising. Clinically, a man of Viscari's violent profession never leaves a door unsecured by accident. It is a trap, carefully set by a predator. She enters the massive, gray, and black room. It is a sterile environment, devoid of warmth. We often mistake empty spaces for safe ones until the door shuts. You and I have seen this precise sequence in countless victim evaluations. Grace places the envelope on the nightstand, experiencing a brief, false surge of relief. Then comes the auditory trigger: footsteps in the hall. Her autonomic nervous system triggers a freeze response. She engages in magical thinking, hoping the apex predator will simply walk past. The heavy door swings open, and Cole Viscari blocks her only exit. He is dressed in an expensive suit, collar undone, sleeves exposing hidden tattoos, a deliberate display of raw, unfiltered dominance. He performs a slow, visual assessment of her body. He catalogues her bare feet, the white lace, the red fabric. He is establishing absolute physical control without saying a single word. True power never has to shout to make you tremble. He vocalizes her name, dropping his pitch to a dangerous, intimate register. This is an auditory anchor designed to disorient her. Grace stammers, her vocal cords tightening under severe stress. She babbles about the envelope, offering unprompted apologies while trying to escape. Viscari blocks her path, arms crossed in a relaxed but immovable posture. He states the facts flatly: 3 in the morning, in your pajamas. He is weaponizing her own embarrassment, watching the flush of autonomic arousal color her skin. She tries to self-regulate, telling herself to breathe, but the proximity of the threat makes emotional regulation impossible. She begs to leave. He steps inside the room instead. The life lesson here is simple. An apology only works on someone who values your comfort. The soft click of the closing door acts as a psychological seal. Grace experiences tachycardia, her heart rate spiking. She attempts to reinstate a boundary by calling him Mr. Viscari. He immediately dismantles it, forcing her to use his first name. This is forced intimacy, a hallmark of coercive control. He closes the distance, moving deliberately until he is just a foot away. The olfactory trigger of his cologne overwhelms her sensory processing. He accuses her of breaking in, fully aware she did no such thing. When she defends herself, noting the door was open, he delivers the clinical kill shot. He admits he left it unlocked specifically for her. If you want to understand manipulation, watch how the spider patiently invites the fly to spin its own web. Observe his methodology closely. Viscari openly admits he engineered her entire panic response. He anticipated her fear, her blind rush upstairs, even her lack of appropriate clothing. This is the confession of a megalomaniacal narcissist who views human beings as predictable chess pieces. He tells her he pays attention to her habits, the lip biting, the humming, her exact coffee order. This hyper-vigilant observation masquerades as care, but it is pure surveillance. Grace retreats instinctively until her spine hits the wall, cornered. He braces one hand beside her head, trapping her. Then, he places 2 fingers under her chin, tilting her gaze to meet his. It is a gentle physical restraint, but a restraint nonetheless. Knowing someone's habits is not love. It is gathering ammunition. He issues a calculated threat disguised as a loss of control. He warns her that if she enters his room again, he will not be responsible for his actions. This is a classic abdication of accountability. Grace stops breathing, caught in predator-induced paralysis. She babbles about the envelope. He slowly brushes his thumb along her jaw. The narcissist loves to feign an internal struggle, claiming he is trying to remember she is an employee. She eagerly agrees, grasping for the safety of her professional role. But she does not flee. Instead, she asks what he might do. Her question is the first symptom of Stockholm Syndrome taking root. She's becoming fascinated by her captor. The dangerous truth is that curiosity has led more victims into the dark than fear ever could. He murmurs about keeping her pinned to the wall. The psychological tension peaks, only to be shattered by a buzzing phone. Instantly, Viscari's demeanor shifts from seductive predator to cold, calculating kingpin. He snaps at the caller, his voice dropping to glacial ice. This rapid emotional shifting is highly typical of the dark triad personality. He orders Grace to leave before he changes his mind. The sudden release of pressure is profound. Grace experiences a massive adrenaline dump and bolts for the door, brushing past him in her desperate escape. But a narcissist never lets the victim leave without the final word. He calls her name one last time, freezing her in place. Control is not just about holding someone captive. It is about deciding exactly when they are allowed to run. Let us examine his final instruction. He tells her to use the intercom or wear armor next time. It is a brilliant psychological maneuver, framing his predatory nature as an unavoidable force she must guard against. He then dismisses her completely. Grace flees to her quarters, locking the door. But the physical lock is useless because her mind is already breached. Her skin experiences somatic memory, tingling where he touched her chin. She suffers from acute insomnia, continuously replaying the encounter. She fixates on his warning, misinterpreting his coercive threat as a romantic promise. She should recognize the extreme danger and evacuate immediately. But the human brain is fragile. Sometimes, the mind tragically confuses the thrill of surviving a predator with the thrill of desire. Instead of fear, Grace reports feelings of heat and intense curiosity. The trauma bond has successfully taken root. At 6 a.m, Viscari initiates digital contact. A text arrives, politely thanking her for the envelope. This is classic intermittent reinforcement. He terrorized her earlier, and now he offers gentle validation. Grace apologizes again, displaying textbook submission. His reply is calculated perfection. He tells her not to be sorry, but careful, warning that next time he will not be a gentleman. Her hands shake as she admits her true pathology. The terror is completely eclipsed by her desire for a second encounter. We must now turn back the clock 3 weeks to grasp her underlying vulnerability. A predator never chooses prey at random. They hunt for the isolated. You and I must examine the factors that make a victim prime for exploitation. 3 weeks earlier, Grace stands in a tiny Illinois town staring at an advertisement for a live-in position in Chicago. The financial lure is engineered to attract the desperate, offering triple her current salary with zero experience required. Her friend Meg exhibits healthy skepticism, warning her it could be a fatal trap, but Grace is heavily burdened by her mother's medical debt. This distress is the exact psychological leverage men like Viscari rely upon. Grace rationalizes the immense risk, deciding to simply make a phone call to verify the job. It is a tragic human failing. We convince ourselves we can safely dip our toes in the water, completely oblivious to the dark undertow waiting to drown us. The recruitment phase is remarkably brief, a major red flag in behavioral analysis. Grace speaks with Bianca, an operative projecting maternal warmth to lower the subject's defenses. The interview questions are clinical. Can she clean and, most importantly, follow instructions without asking questions? They are screening for blind compliance. When Grace expresses surprise at the lack of an in-person meeting, Bianca applies subtle psychological pressure, asking if Grace is truly suitable. Grace mentally reviews her massive financial stresses, hospital bills, and eviction notice, family debt. The trap snaps shut. She eagerly confirms her own subjugation. Bianca tells her to pack for a long stay, a deeply chilling euphemism. Desperation blinds us to the bars of the cage until it locks. The extraction from her support system is absolute. Her mother weeps, instinctively sensing danger, but Grace uses the illusion of financial salvation to justify her departure. She promises to call daily, a naive commitment she cannot possibly keep. A luxury black car arrives. The silent driver enforces her psychological isolation during the transit. Grace leaves her safe reality behind, entering a metropolis that triggers both terror and euphoria in her nervous system. When she sees the Viscari estate, she is overwhelmed. The heavy iron gates and stone facade project, immense power and buried secrets. It is vital to recognize that awe is often just terror wrapped in a beautiful package. She is voluntarily stepping inside a highly fortified, beautifully disguised prison. The driver offers a microscopic smile, welcoming her to the estate. Bianca intercepts her at the service entrance. Do not be fooled by the kind eyes. Operatives like Bianca act as the wardens of these environments. They observe everything and report it back. Bianca escorts her inside for a tour before Viscari returns. The interior is deliberately designed to crush an outsider's ego. The cold marble silently communicates that Grace is the least valuable asset in the building. When Grace asks about the other residents, Bianca employs calculated ambiguity. She mentions security, associates, and a complicated family. This vague phrasing keeps the subject entirely off balance. True psychological control always begins by ensuring the captive never fully understands the hidden rules of the house. Let us open the file on Grace Moore. You and I are going to unpack this case together, examining the precise moment her psychological conditioning began. The domestic manager, Bianca, established the initial boundaries of captivity disguised as employment. Light housekeeping, meal preparation, and 3 absolute rules. Do not enter the kingpin's office. Do not enter his bedroom. Above all, do not question his operations. Grace's immediate gastrointestinal distress was her body's primal warning system activating, yet she dismissed her own survival instincts. The life lesson here is elementary but vital. When your intuition signals danger, listen to it. Instead, Grace simply nodded, stepping blindly into the web. She would encounter Cole Vescari that very afternoon, entirely unaware of the trauma bond taking root. Cole Vescari presented the classic physical markers of a high-functioning megalomaniac narcissist. In his early 30s, impeccably groomed in bespoke tailoring, he used his appearance to assert dominance, but it was his gaze, dark, flat, clinically assessing, that revealed the apex predator beneath the Italian wool. When he finally addressed her, stating rather than asking her identity, he immediately established the power dynamic. He approached the complex espresso machine, moving into her physical space to demonstrate territorial control. He probed her origins, extracting data about her vulnerable familial ties, the sick mother, the financial desperation. Grace halted her oversharing, mistakenly assuming he lacked interest. In truth, a predator always catalogs a target's vulnerabilities. Grace attempted to rationalize her presence, citing economic necessity. Cole immediately stripped away her formal defenses, demanding she discard polite titles. This was a calculated dismantling of professional boundaries, a classic manipulation tactic. He warned her that the staff were not her friends, actively isolating her from potential support systems. "Keep your distance, stay safe," he advised, stepping intimately close to her in a deliberate contradiction of his own words. When Grace questioned what she needed safety from, his fleeting smile confirmed her transgression of the rules. The lesson we must internalize is that isolation is the narcissist's primary weapon. By dictating who she could trust, he successfully positioned himself as the sole authority in her new reality. During the initial adaptation phase, Grace's nervous system endured chronic environmental stress. The estate operated with the circadian rhythm of a criminal enterprise. Nocturnal arrivals, foreign dialects, and late-night disruptions. Yet, Cole orchestrated a brilliant facade of normalcy. He left unwashed dishes and boxed in the gymnasium, performing mundane activities to induce cognitive dissonance. This is how the megalomaniac narcissist humanizes himself. When he critiqued her coffee, Grace experienced a micro-rebellion, suggesting he brew it himself. This reactive defiance is common before compliance sets in. Notice how he did not punish her outburst. The profound lesson here is that intermittent reinforcement, blending kindness with control, is always more effective than constant terror. Cole capitalized on her minor insubordination, warning her about her attitude before abruptly reversing course. He told her not to apologize, labeling her defiance as refreshing. This push and pull dynamic deliberately destabilized her emotional equilibrium. From that point forward, his surveillance became overt. He tracked her movements across the compound, his gaze lingering to ensure she felt the weight of his attention. Instead of triggering her fight or flight response, this predatory focus induced a physiological arousal, flushed skin, elevated heart rate. Here we see the embryonic stages of Stockholm Syndrome, as fear masquerades as attraction. By her second week, when she encountered a security operative named Nate in the service room, her perception of reality was already severely compromised. Let us observe this interaction closely, you and I, because the guard, Nate, functions as an unwitting catalyst for her descent. While performing mundane domestic tasks, Grace was interrogated about her awareness of the syndicate's true nature. Nate framed his disclosures as friendly gossip, inquiring if she found the environment unusual. When she admitted she was instructed not to ask questions, Nate leaned in, bridging the physical gap to share illicit information about the Vescari family's extralegal enterprises. Her autonomic nervous system reacted violently, a sudden drop in her stomach as the undeniable reality of her employer's status as a criminal kingpin was vocalized. The lesson is clear: willful ignorance cannot shield the human mind from the creeping horror of the truth. The operative employed a potent psychological pacifier, assuring Grace that the kingpin protected his subordinates. That evening, driven by morbid curiosity, Grace accessed public intelligence regarding the Vescari syndicate. She encountered documented allegations of racketeering and organized violence, accompanied by photographic evidence of Cole displaying psychopathic calm outside a courthouse. A healthy psychological profile would have immediately initiated an evacuation protocol. Instead, Grace engaged in catastrophic rationalization. She weighed her survival against her mother's medical debt. The tragic lesson of human behavior is that economic trauma often forces the mind to normalize extreme, life-threatening danger, trading long-term safety for immediate, desperate financial relief. Grace finalized her cognitive compromise by closing her laptop and formulating a set of impossible internal rules. She vowed to extract financial resources while remaining emotionally sterile, entirely underestimating the insidious nature of the trauma bond. By the third week, her hypervigilance began to erode. We observe her engaged in a self-soothing behavior, humming a familiar melody from her childhood while cleaning. This acoustic vulnerability drew the predator out. Cole manifested silently, using a sarcastic critique of her vocalizing to assert his omnipresence. When she exhibited an exaggerated startle response, she immediately apologized. Must understand this fundamental lesson. Attempting to outsmart a master manipulator by creating internal mental boundaries is a complete delusion. Cole immediately softened his approach, pivoting from intimidation to calculated validation. He analyzed her psychological profile aloud, identifying her rural origins, her polite syntax, and her inherent wholesomeness. By contrasting her perceived innocence against the terrified subordinates in his dark environment, he engaged in textbook narcissistic mirroring. He made her feel entirely unique. When he abruptly truncated his sentence and abandoned his coffee, it was not a loss of control, but a highly orchestrated retreat designed to leave her in a state of unresolved anticipation. Standing confused and flushed, Grace's psychological defenses completely collapsed. A crucial lesson here. When a predator highlights how different you are from their usual victims, they are simply preparing a custom cage. We now document a period of high-friction behavioral avoidance. Grace instituted a rigid coping mechanism, brewing his caustic coffee at dawn and vanishing before his arrival. She was actively fleeing the somatic memory of his physical touch, the phantom sensation of his fingers manipulating her jawline from a prior incident. The cognitive dissonance was fracturing her psyche. She was terrified of his promises, yet biologically driven to uncover their execution. Bianca, the seasoned domestic facilitator, easily diagnosed this avoidant pathology. Confronting Grace in the kitchen, Bianca efficiently stripped away her pathetic rationalizations. The life lesson is unavoidable. Running from a psychological trigger only grants it absolute dominion over your subconscious mind. Stop running and observe the trap. Bianca dismantled Grace's defense that she was merely maintaining professional boundaries. correctly identifying her behavior as pathological flight. Desperate for an ally, Grace confessed to the nocturnal encounter, describing his words as an ambiguous cocktail of warning and promise. This duality is the hallmark of the megalomaniac narcissist. They format their threats as seductions, short-circuiting the victim's threat assessment capabilities. Bianca, acting as an enabler within this dysfunctional system, offered a terrifyingly accurate clinical assessment of the kingpin. She labeled him dangerous, highly possessive, and fundamentally incapable of healthy emotional regulation. The stark lesson embedded here is that enablers will accurately describe the monster, yet still gently encourage you to pet it. Bianca further romanticized his pathology, describing his attachment style as absolute and consuming, a polite synonym for psychological suffocation. Grace attempted to anchor herself in the reality of their socioeconomic divide, insisting she was merely a servant. Bianca quickly shattered this illusion, confirming his predatory surveillance was focused entirely upon Grace. Right then, Cole entered the clinical arena. He was stripped of his corporate armor, dressed in damp athletic wear, radiating raw biological vitality. This orchestrated display of casual humanity is often more disarming to a victim than any show of force. The lesson here is paramount. Seeing the captor as ordinary flesh and blood systematically dissolves the captive's defensive barriers, making the victim incredibly vulnerable. Now, I want you to pay close attention to this next escalation. The moment Cole locked eyes with Grace, she instinctively regressed to formal titles, a futile attempt to erect a linguistic shield. Cole immediately dismantled it, using the enabler Bianca to validate the removal of boundaries. Once isolated, the silence in the room became an active interrogation technique. Grace engaged in frantic cleaning behaviors to manage her surging cortisol levels. When Cole directly challenged her avoidance, Grace finally cracked. She verbally confessed her fear, her inappropriate emotional responses, and the lingering tactile memory of his hands. The essential lesson is here that confessing your vulnerabilities to a megalomaniac does not inspire mercy. It simply hands them the blueprint to your destruction. Grace pathetically attempted to reframe her panic as professional boundary maintenance. Cole's response was a low laugh, an auditory signal of his complete dominance. He relabeled her boundaries as cowardice, physically cornering her against the cabinetry. Notice the sensory overload he deployed. His proximity forced her to process his scent, a biological anchor of primal exertion. He confidently diagnosed her fear, contrasting it with his own absolute certainty regarding their entanglement. As her spine hit the counter, she realized she was completely trapped. His hand rose, hovering just millimeters from her skin without making actual contact. The profound lesson of psychological control is that the agonizing anticipation of a caress is infinitely more paralyzing than the physical act itself. Let us open the case file on Cole around Grace. Today, you and I are going to unpack this psychological dynamic together. We observe the initial stages of a classic trauma bond. Cole, a textbook megalomaniac narcissist, uses physical proximity to establish dominance. He hovers near his employee, Grace, cultivating an intense atmospheric pressure. Grace attempts to enforce cognitive boundaries, reminding him of their professional disparity. She claims she is off limits, yet the physical magnetism betrays her rational mind. Cole smiles, a calculated, dangerous micro-expression of a predator acknowledging a willing captive. Just as the tension peaks, the associate, Nate, interrupts with a situational crisis, forcing Cole to mask his predatory intent. Notice how rapidly Cole's neurological state shifts. The professional mask of the cartel kingpin slides flawlessly into place as Nate reports the Marino faction's sudden demand for an audience. Cole processes the threat with clinical detachment, scheduling the confrontation for 2 in the afternoon. But the megalomaniac cannot relinquish his grip on his primary target. He pivots back to Grace, issuing a direct psychological directive to cease her avoidance behaviors. It is a command disguised as casual observation. He departs the room, leaving Grace in a state of acute autonomic arousal. Her cardiac rhythm accelerates. She stands trapped in the kitchen, paralyzed by the realization that her mundane employment has mutated into a deeply dangerous psychological captivity. Later that afternoon, the environmental stresses escalate. Grace engages in routine cleaning protocols when auditory markers of severe conflict echo from Cole's office. The survival instinct dictates avoidance, yet Grace's developing fixation draws her toward the danger. A hostile voice demands territorial concessions regarding casino revenues. Cole's vocal tone drops to absolute zero, a primary indicator of antisocial personality pathology about to turn violent. A physical altercation ensues, followed by abrupt silence. Overriding all logical self-preservation, Grace turns the brass handle. She discovers Cole seated behind his desk, entirely devoid of emotional affect. A bleeding rival lies, incapacitated on the floor, flanked by 3 armed enforcers, waiting for a lethal command. Cole registers her intrusion with carefully calibrated neutrality. He instructs her to withdraw, swiftly repositioning his physical mass to shield her visual field from the bleeding subject. This is a territorial defense mechanism, not genuine altruism. When Grace hesitates, Cole's vocal inflection hardens into an absolute command. Unfortunately, the injured rival initiates a fatal miscalculation. He verbally degrades Grace, labeling her as Cole's new plaything. The reaction is instantaneous. Cole's motor functions execute with terrifying velocity. In a fraction of a second, the kingpin has his hand locked around the rival's trachea, lifting him against the gravitational pull. The threat he whispers is utterly devoid of empathy, promising immediate respiratory cessation. The victim experiences acute hypoxia, clawing desperately at the secretary enforcer intervenes, logically advising that the target holds no strategic value. Cole maintains the strangulation for one agonizing neurological beat before releasing the pressure. He issues a final chilling directive to the Marino syndicate. Future infractions will be met with maximum lethality. As the casualty is dragged from the perimeter, the room falls silent. The psychological focus snaps violently back to Grace. Cole analyzes her facial micro-expressions, questioning her fear response. A healthy amygdala would trigger absolute terror. Instead, Grace exhibits the foundational symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome. She looks at the violent predator and whispers that she feels secure. Cole quickly compartmentalizes his violence, assuring her she should only fear his environment, never him. He rationalizes his brutality as necessary territorial defense, categorizing Grace as his personal property. He attempts to reframe this toxic possession as professional protection. The megalomaniac narcissist recognizes her profound innocence as a mirror reflecting his own deep moral decay. He touches her face, a fleeting tactile connection. He confesses that her pure psychological state induces a desire for his own rehabilitation. He accurately diagnoses the situation as highly dangerous. The life lesson here is starkly clinical. When innocence tries to sanitize corruption, the innocence usually becomes stained. Come with me, We are about to uncover how deeply this pathology runs. Grace experiences acute cognitive dissonance, her breath catching in her throat. Cole demonstrates a rare moment of self-awareness, stating his psychological nature is irrevocably fixed. He insists she requires a partner free from chronic violence, but the traumatic bond is already crystallizing. That evening, Grace suffers from severe insomnia. Her visual cortex repeatedly replays the image of Cole executing lethal force, against his instinctual drive to shield her body. She dissects her own inappropriate emotional responses. She knows she should reject his bloody territorialism, yet she craves the safety of his dominance. Her internal conflict is interrupted by a digital stimulus from her captor. This text exchange serves as a textbook escalation of surveillance behavior. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? Cole states he can observe her pacing from his vantage point across the architectural courtyard. Grace correctly identifies this as predatory stalking, labeling it unnatural. Cole instantly reframes the boundary violation as a necessary security protocol. To demonstrate his absolute observational dominance, he recites a highly specific psychological profile. He documents her auditory habits, her glucose dependency in the morning, her rigid familial communication schedule, and her anxious physical tics. He weaponizes this intimacy, proving he monitors her micro-behaviors with relentless precision. He specifically notes the current mastication of her lower lip. The subject immediately ceases the nervous tic and scans the dark perimeter. She visually locates his silhouette, a shadow asserting omnipotence over her private space. She attempts to apply clinical boundaries, typing that his conduct is obsessively inappropriate and violates established employment parameters. Cole clinically dismisses her terminology, substituting the word intense. His final directive is a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He orders her to engage the deadbolt, implying that his own predatory impulses might override his superficial restraint. Grace complies, yet deliberately leaves her illumination active. She submits to the surveillance. It is a profound manifestation of the Stockholm dynamic, accepting the watcher as a permanent fixture of her reality. The behavioral conditioning escalates via enforced costuming. The household manager, Bianca, presents Grace with an elegant, restrictive black garment, a stark deviation from her standard oversized clothing. Grace exhibits defensive resistance, citing her lowly hierarchical status as a domestic worker. However, Bianca reveals the underlying machination. The megalomaniac has explicitly mandated Grace's high visibility at tonight's gathering. Cole anticipates the arrival of highly dangerous antisocial personalities. By forcing Grace into a visually prominent role, he is effectively marking his territory. He is using her physical presence as a psychological deterrent, signaling to the criminal elements that she is exclusively under his absolute and lethal jurisdiction. Grace attempts to rationalize the flawed logic. How does a physically exposing garment equate to personal security? Bianca clarifies that visibility equates to claimed property in their brutal criminal hierarchy. The lesson we can draw from this is simple. In environments governed by power, your physical presentation is entirely a tool of survival. At 7:45, Grace studies her reflection, experiencing a minor dissociative episode. The woman in the mirror appears dangerously sophisticated, stripped of her innocence. Nate interrupts with an auditory signal of approval, casually predicting Cole's extreme reaction. Grace issues a weak verbal denial. Nate merely offers his arm, escorting her before her anxiety triggers flight. The architectural environment has been entirely reconfigured into a theater of wealth and criminal networking. The atmospheric stimuli are overwhelming. Classical acoustics, immaculate service staff, and the presence of extreme, illicitly acquired capital. Grace's imposter syndrome activates instantly. Nate implements rigid behavioral parameters. Distribute the alcohol, maintain a neutral facial effect, minimize verbal exchange, and strictly avoid the gambling parlor. That specific room operates as the epicenter of their sociopathic dealings. Nate vanishes into the mass of bodies, leaving Grace isolated in a sea of predators. She begins her mechanical circulation, distributing crystal glassware while remaining entirely invisible to the elite guests who view her merely as an object. Let us evaluate this next behavioral pivot together. A female guest initiates a baseless confrontation regarding imaginary contamination on the glassware. Grace exhibits passive submission, apologizing to avoid conflict. Returning to the culinary preparation zone, she registers a sudden atmospheric density, a biological radar alerting her to the apex predator's approach. Cole paralyzes his own forward momentum at the threshold. His visual assessment is slow, deliberate, and highly inappropriate for an employer. He struggles to regulate his vocal cords. He attempts to deploy the clinical term professional to describe her, but his dilated pupils communicate pure, unadulterated possession. When Grace inquires about his operational needs, he issues a strict geographical confinement order. Cole explicitly warns her against engaging with the predatory males attending the function. He clinically acknowledges his associates' pathology. They are drawn to purity, specifically to destroy it. Grace attempts to assert false autonomy, claiming she can defend herself. Cole dismisses her delusion instantly. He bypasses her logic entirely and attacks her emotional center, his hand nearly making tactile contact with her face. He deploys a rare submissive request. The lesson here is simple and grim. A predator's temporary gentleness is often their most lethal weapon. He labels her beautiful, a definitive shift from the professional boundary. The next hour dissolves into a dissociative blur of champagne and polite smiles, leaving her stranded in acute tachycardia. Let us open this case file together, you and I. We begin by observing the subject, Grace, engaged in routine catering duties. She experiences an unwanted physical intrusion from an older, intoxicated guest. Notice her physiological response, not terror but a sudden spike of defensive anger. However, before she can assert boundaries, our primary subject intervenes, Cole. The classic megalomaniac narcissist. He does not step in out of altruism. To a man with his pathology, a hand on his perceived property is a direct challenge to his dominion. His voice drops to a lethal register, instantly paralyzing the aggressor. The lesson here is fundamental. True predators do not need to yell to establish their absolute control over a room. The intoxicated guest attempts to mask his transgression with false camaraderie, calling her lovely. Observe Cole's immediate spatial manipulation. He places his physical body as a barrier, a textbook territorial display. When Cole rests his hand on the man's shoulder, it appears casual to the untrained eye. But a closer clinical analysis reveals his fingers digging into nerve clusters. He is inflicting covert, agonizing pain while maintaining a veneer of civility. He delegates the physical removal to a subordinate, Nate, ensuring the guest is escorted away under the guise of safety. This is how the megalomaniac narcissist operates. They sanitize their violence. It teaches us that the most dangerous threats often wear a polite smile. With the immediate threat removed, Cole turns his focus back to Grace. His facial muscles are rigidly controlled, masking the violent neurochemical storm underneath. He asks if she is hurt, framing her face with hands that vibrate from suppressed adrenaline. When she minimizes the event, he instantly invalidates her reality, telling her she is shaking. This is the seed of psychological conditioning. He dictates her emotional state. He promises to break bones to protect her, a statement she correctly identifies as extreme. Yet, Cole reframes his aggression as simple accuracy. The chilling reality we must acknowledge is that when a dangerous individual convinces you their violence is a shield, the psychological trap has already been set. Cole categorizes Grace as innocent, elevating her to a dangerous pedestal. He calls her the only clean thing in his life, a classic projection of his own psychological decay onto a pure object. He vows to burn the environment to the ground before letting anyone taint her. This is not romance, it is absolute ownership. When external stimuli interrupt, a rival faction arriving, he is forced to break the hypnotic hold. He issues a rapid series of commands, stripping away her autonomy under the guise of protection. Stay with the guards. Do not be alone. He promises to return to discuss the unspoken tension between them. We must remember that isolation is the first and most vital step in cultivating profound psychological dependency. Grace is left in a state of cognitive dissonance, her heart accelerating as she processes his declaration. As the social event continues, she begins to exhibit early signs of trauma bonding. She performs her tasks mechanically, her reticular activating system now entirely focused on Cole's movements through the room. His periodic surveillance, which a healthy mind would find deeply suffocating, is misinterpreted by Grace as being cherished. Later, she intercepts a whispered conversation between guests. The rumor is that Cole systematically fractured the offending guest's hand in the vehicle, not as a measure of discipline, but as a marker of intense, terrifying possession. The mind will often romanticize what it cannot safely escape. You and I must closely examine Grace's internal reaction to this horrific news. The guests note that she has no comprehension of the dark syndicate she has entered, yet she is already submerged. A psychologically resilient individual would experience profound horror upon learning a man's hand was broken over a touch. They would immediately initiate a flight response. Grace, however, feels a dangerous, intoxicating heat. This is the physiological onset of Stockholm Syndrome. She is beginning to align her survival instincts with the sheer power of her captor. By 1 a.m, the mansion is silent. She is performing a mundane task when he corners her in the isolated kitchen, deliberately invading the last of her safe space. Cole positions himself directly behind her, making use of physical proximity to disrupt her cognitive processing. He admits his inability to compartmentalize his obsession, an uncharacteristic vulnerability for a criminal of his classification. He confesses that his desires for her bypass his usual transactional nature. When he touches her face, it is an action of pure compulsion. He details his psychological state, explaining that seeing another male touch her triggered a lethal homicidal ideation, not merely a protective instinct. This is the dark core of the megalomaniac narcissist. They do not view their partners as separate entities, but as extensions of their own ego. To touch what is theirs is to invite total annihilation. He delivers the ultimate psychological anchor, stating plainly that she belongs to him. He bypasses her consent entirely, rendering questions of morality or desert irrelevant. This is a masterful display of psychological subjugation. He challenges her to deny the connection, fully aware that he has already dismantled her emotional defenses. And Grace capitulates. She confesses that she has felt this dangerous pull since an earlier encounter. In this moment, the trauma bond solidifies. She admits her perceived inadequacy, stating she does not know how to fulfill his needs. He instantly validates her, praising her lack of fear. The lesson here is haunting. When we mistake terror for passion, we willingly hand over our own chains. The physical escalation is inevitable. He requests permission to kiss her, a performative illusion of choice before total commitment. The biochemical rush of the encounter floods her nervous system. When they separate, he immediately redefines her status. She is no longer an employee. She has been absorbed into his immediate radius of control. He declares that any perceived slight against her will be met with his absolute retribution. When she correctly identifies this dynamic as intense, he offers a rare moment of clinical self-awareness. He admits his possessiveness is likely toxic, a manipulation tactic designed to foster false trust through feigned honesty. We often forgive the darkest traits when they are presented as a confession. He initiates a secondary, slower physical connection, cementing his neurological anchor within her brain. He explicitly states he is not releasing her, overriding any future attempts she might make to flee. He makes use of the classic predator's plea, claiming he is not a moral man, but will attempt to improve for her sake. This places the burden of his morality squarely on her shoulders. As he escorts her through the darkened corridors, guiding her by the hand, a fundamental shift occurs in Grace's psyche. She abandons her flight response entirely. She accepts her role within his terrifying world. It is a profound tragedy of the human mind. The survival sometimes demands we fall desperately in love with the monster in the dark. Let us pause for a moment, you and I, to evaluate the clinical data we have gathered so far. If you were to rate the psychological conditioning in this case file from 1 to 10, where would it fall? We see the classic markers of an engineered dependency, the isolated location, the slow erosion of boundaries, the sudden onset of perceived devotion. As we transition into the next phase of our behavioral study, observe how the environment rapidly constricts. 3 days post-incident, Grace awakens to find the subordinate, Nate, stationed directly outside her sleeping quarters. His normally relaxed facial micro-expressions are tight and forced. The illusion of safety has fractured, replaced by the stark reality of her containment. It is early morning, yet her autonomy has already been revoked. Nate informs her that she now requires a dedicated security detail. The justification is clinical. External variables observed the interaction at the gathering, introducing dangerous complications into their clandestine world. She is immediately summoned to the primary subject's location. Cole remains in his physical conditioning attire, his nervous system clearly flooded with cortisol and repressed rage. He refuses to make initial eye contact, a tactic to heighten her internal anxiety before the confrontation. When he finally locks eyes with her, the ambient aggression forces her to physically recoil. A rival syndicate, the Moreno faction, has begun gathering intelligence on her. Cole explicitly outlines the threat matrix. The rival faction has identified her as his psychological vulnerability, elevating her status to a primary target for abduction or severe physical trauma. He closes the physical distance, crouching to establish direct, inescapable eye contact. He emphasizes the lethal stakes of his reality. When he admits that harm to her would devastate him, it is a calculated display of emotional reliance. Grace's logical brain attempts one final, rational escape route. She suggests leaving. Cole shuts this down with absolute linguistic finality. The word is a steel door slamming shut. We must recognize that, in the mind of the megalomaniac narcissist, losing control of the object is a fate worse than death. He frames her captivity as an act of vital preservation, stating he refuses to lose her due to a tactical error. Grace reaches out to touch his face, a clear manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome in full bloom. She attempts to soothe the very entity that has engineered her imprisonment. Cole reveals his ultimate terrifying objective. He desires her in perpetuity, openly acknowledging that proximity to him is equivalent to a terminal diagnosis. He immediately institutes a severe behavioral protocol. She is forbidden to exit the perimeter unescorted. She cannot interact with unverified individuals. She is banned from approaching the glass after dusk. To a healthy mind, this is absolute insanity. To the captor, it is merely protection. Let us examine this case file together. When Grace interrupts Cole's anxious spiraling with a kiss, she is not demonstrating romance. She is displaying a trauma response, frantically managing her captor's emotional volatility. Cole immediately responds with a territorial claim, stating she belongs to him. This is the absolute hallmark of a megalomaniac narcissist, confusing ownership with affection. In the following days, the psychological walls close in completely. His enforcer, Nate, monitors her every mundane movement, from buying groceries to folding laundry. Grace mutters about the absurdity of this prison, but Nate blindly defends his boss. The lesson here is quite simple. We so often mistake the tightening grip of a suffocating cage for the warm, protective embrace of safety. Notice how the enforcer reinforces the victim's delusion. Nate tells Grace she alone has melted the calculated exterior of a dangerous man. This perfectly eclipses her Stockholm Syndrome, convincing the captive that her compliance is actually a unique superpower. That night, her insomnia acts as a physical manifestation of severe psychological distress. Yet, when her phone buzzes, it is not comfort she receives, but active surveillance. Cole knows she is awake because he is constantly watching her room. He summons her to his quarters, completely dismissing her faint protests about boundaries. When she enters, he is scanning the city for invisible threats. It is a profound tragedy of the human mind. When you live your life in a state of endless paranoia, intimacy becomes just another vulnerability to guard against. The clinical dialogue in this moment is absolutely textbook. Cole confesses his pathological insomnia, framing it as the heavy burden of having a new possession he fears losing. He warns her directly about the collateral damage of his lifestyle, promising a future of endless paranoia and physical danger. He explicitly tells her she will be living in a cage. Yet, in the deepest throes of her Stockholm Syndrome, Grace steps closer to her captor. She volunteers to be locked inside, confusing psychological surrender with an independent choice. She believes she is making a bold romantic sacrifice, unaware her autonomy has already been dismantled. We must remember this sobering reality about human survival. People do not naturally seek out chains, but a starved heart will eagerly find comfort in the weight of iron. Listen closely to the mechanics of this exchange. Cole executes a masterclass in manipulative vulnerability. He loudly vocalizes his flaws, claiming he is fundamentally unsafe. This calculated confession is designed to elicit exactly what follows. Grace actively begs him to keep her. She adopts the literal language of property, pleading to be retained like an object. She cites feelings of protection as sourcing her entire sense of self-worth to a violent criminal. He seals this psychological contract with a desperate kiss before commanding her to stay the night in his bed. It is a truly terrifying display of pure behavioral conditioning. The painful truth of our nature is this: when a person is starved of validation, they will gladly hand over the keys to their own mind just to feel visible. The subject now enters the predator's inner sanctum under the guise of mere rest. Grace immediately notes the wealth of her surroundings, the expensive bedsheets acting as a layer of gilded entrapment. Cole slides in beside her, pulling her against his chest to establish physical dominance. He promises restraint, which she tragically interprets as chivalry. In reality, a clinical narcissist derives profound pleasure from demonstrating absolute control over their own urges, just as they control their victims. They lie together in the dark, his heartbeat calming, now that he has successfully secured his prize for the night. We may never forget this simple reality. Just because a dangerous predator decides not to strike you today does not mean you are safely resting in the arms of a gentle protector. In the darkness, Grace initiates an exchange of intimate truths, a desperate attempt to humanize her captor. Cole's response is highly diagnostic. He claims he is terrified of something taking her away from him. Notice the clinical phrasing here. It is entirely about his potential loss of possession, not her actual well-being. When Grace confesses she is falling in love, the psychological trap snaps shut. Her trauma bond has permanently mutated into romantic attachment. Cole then forces her to solidify the statement, demanding absolute certainty before delivering a truly chilling admission. He plainly states that even if she hated him, his obsession would remain completely unaltered. It is a vital lesson in dark psychology. True affection requires mutual consent, but a pathological obsession only requires the existence of a target. We now arrive at the final stage of the subject's psychological consumption. Cole fully weaponizes the concept of love, openly admitting his attachment is obsessive, unhealthy, and profoundly dangerous. He rationalizes his extreme need for control and severe security rules as an act of selfless devotion. This is the ultimate manipulation tactic of the megalomaniac mind, framing their absolute tyranny as your salvation. Grace responds by kissing him deeply, fully surrendering to her trauma bond. She demands all of him, entirely dismissing his hollow, performative warnings about the ruin he brings. His reverent kiss is actually the quiet triumph of a predator claiming his willing prey. This brings us to a harsh but vital life truth. When a broken person openly tells you they are dangerous, you must always believe them the very first time. Today, you and I are going to unpack this case together. Reviewing the early transcripts of their relationship, we see a textbook display of predatory grooming, masked as profound tenderness. Cole constantly asks for her consent, wrapping his dominance in words of absolute devotion. To Grace, this feels like an awakening, a moment of deep vulnerability. Yet, this is exactly how a narcissistic apex predator operates. He systematically narrows her entire world down to him alone, making her feel utterly his. She even admits to fearing his criminal life, but never him. It is classic Stockholm Syndrome, finding false refuge in your captor. A simple truth we must all remember is that the one who creates the danger can never truly be the one to save us from it. Notice how he pulls her physically closer to reinforce his psychological hold, vowing to keep her safe from the very chaos he orchestrates. He thanks her for choosing him, fully aware of his monstrous nature, while openly admitting he will keep her regardless of whether he deserves her. This is a masterclass in manipulation. He plays the broken, unworthy man to draw out her deep-seated maternal instinct, deeply entrenched in trauma bonding, falls right into the trap. By the time morning breaks, she finds him staring at her while she sleeps. He claims it is just a habit born of a violent lifestyle, but it is actually hyper-vigilant control. In life, we must realize that someone obsessively watching our every move is not a guardian, but a warden holding the keys. The morning routine presents a fascinating study in psychological subjugation disguised as caregiving. Cole insists on bringing her breakfast himself, bypassing his usual staff. This calculated act of domestic intimacy is designed to strip away the intimidating mob boss exterior and replace it with the illusion of a loving partner. Grace accepts this willingly, resting in his expensive sheets, completely absorbed by his environment. She misinterprets this cultivated isolation as the feeling of home. When she confesses her love, he demands she repeat it over and over, feeding his grandiose ego. His need to hear his own name attached to her devotion is striking. It points to a bitter reality. Sometimes what we mistake for profound love is simply a predator admiring his prize. The illusion of their domestic peace shatters instantly with a heavy knock on the door. When his associate announces a package left specifically for Grace, Cole reverts from the tender lover back to the militant kingpin in a fraction of a second. His commands are absolute. He orders her to lock the door and to only open it for him, effectively turning the bedroom into a holding cell. Grace obeys with shaking hands, her nervous system overwhelmed by the sudden adrenaline and dread. She begins to realize the immense cost of aligning with a violent man, waiting like a trapped animal for the incoming storm. Let us look at this piece, shall we? This moment teaches us a harsh lesson. You cannot invite a wolf into your bed and expect the rest of the pack to stay away. The package holds a surveillance photo of Grace carrying a warning written in red ink. This is a targeted psychological strike meant to undermine Cole's absolute authority. His reaction is cold and immediate. He orders her to pack a bag, stripping away her physical autonomy without a second thought. He explains she is being relocated to a private compound, moving her around like a chess piece. When she tries to argue, she shuts the conversation down. His enemies have breached his inner circle, and her exposure is a direct insult to his need for total dominance. It forces us to confront the reality she has willingly ignored. The true price of being completely guarded by a deeply dangerous man is the sudden and absolute loss of your own personal freedom. Observe the subtle shift in Cole's manipulation strategy here. When his authoritarian commands fail to move her, he pivots to emotional vulnerability. His voice cracks. He acts desperate and terrified, begging her not to fight him. This display of raw emotion is highly effective on a subject with Stockholm Syndrome. Grace, desperate to comfort her captor, refuses to leave unless he joins her, firmly believing they are equal partners in this crisis. They negotiate a 2-day separation, which he frames as a massive sacrifice for her sake. It is a brilliant, albeit twisted, psychological maneuver. He retains total control while making her feel like she won the argument. A vital life lesson emerges here. True compromise is never born from coercion dressed up as desperation. The journey to the safe house acts as a physical manifestation of Grace's psychological entrapment. 2 armed guards transport her far from civilization into a fortified compound in the woods. While Grace tries to normalize the terrifying situation by calling the house nice, the guards remind her that it is an absolute fortress. Every camera, alarm, and reinforced door is clear evidence of Cole's obsessive need for control. He has essentially placed his prized possession in a high-security vault. The space is entirely his, carefully furnished to ensure she never forgets exactly who owns her. It encapsulates a dark truth about human behavior that we must recognize. A gilded cage is still just a cage, no matter how warmly the warden decorates the inside. When examining Luca's confinement within Vittorio's estate, we observe a textbook example of psychological conditioning. You and I must look at this objectively. The environment should have triggered a desperate need to escape what was undeniably a prison. Instead, Luca rationalized the isolation as absolute protection. Surrounded by his belongings, the dependency took root. Day one was marked by severe agitation, pacing, and an inability to eat, mirroring the withdrawal symptoms of a trauma bond. Vittorio's enforcers maintained constant surveillance under the guise of concern. When the phone finally rang at 2 in the morning, Vittorio's voice offered the exact intermittent reinforcement Luca craved. Her confession of fear was the ultimate submission to his control. The audio transcripts of this late-night phone call reveal Vittorio's masterful use of perceived vulnerability. He expressed intense distress over Luca being alone, entirely ignoring his armed guards. This deliberate framing forced the victim to comfort the captor. His voice dropping an octave was a calculated cue to simulate intimacy. At detailing his negotiations with the rival syndicate, he explicitly framed Luca as his property, establishing her as the core of his violent universe. His chilling assertion that he stopped being safe the moment he fell in love was the pinnacle of megalomaniac manipulation. He shifted the burden of his criminal lifestyle onto his victim's shoulders, making her responsible for his future violence. Day 2 arrived with a heavy, ominous storm. The weather conditions perfectly mirrored the escalating psychological pressure. Thunder and lightning created an environment of sensory overload. When the power grid failed, plunging the estate into darkness, Luca's dependency on her captors solidified. As Marco guarded the window, Luca received a call from an untraceable number. The rival syndicate understood the psychological landscape perfectly. A cold, unfamiliar voice warned that iron gates and armed guards offered no true security. It was a precise cognitive strike aimed at shattering her fragile illusion of safety. 90 minutes later, Vittorio arrived, soaked from the rain. He moved through the shadowed estate with the predatory grace of an apex killer, entirely consumed by the perceived threat to his prized possession. Vittorio's immediate physical examination of Luca was not medical concern, but a frantic inventory of his belongings. His hands, checking her for injuries, demonstrated a possessive frenzy. Upon confirming the threat, his reaction was explosive, demanding they evacuate. He presented the illusion of escape, promising to relocate her to a foreign country. Make no mistake, this was merely a relocation of her cage. His declaration that he was done negotiating was a textbook display of narcissistic rage. As the storm intensified, Marco provided a critical behavioral analysis of the rivals. The phone call had never been a physical threat. It was an advanced psychological probe designed specifically to measure Vittorio's emotional volatility and expose his most critical vulnerability. Let us examine this crucial realization together. Vittorio knew his reaction was precisely what the opposition desired. He had displayed blind panic, confirming his emotional compromise. As his arms tightened around Luca, Marco dissected the rival's strategy. They executed a calculated bluff to verify Luca was the kingpin's ultimate weakness. Vittorio's claim that she was not his weakness, but his everything is a fascinating semantic evasion. A megalomaniac narcissist cannot admit vulnerability, so he reframes his fatal flaw as a romantic absolute. The rivals understood this distinction was meaningless. Grounded by the storm, the pair remained isolated in the safe house, bound together in an escalating web of manufactured fear and obsessive control. The psychological entrenchment deepened as Vittorio demanded physical contact to soothe his own dysregulation. He needed her presence to anchor his fracturing reality. His claim that he almost lost her was an intentional exaggeration of the threat, designed to heighten her trauma response. Presenting the false dilemma of choosing between her safety and his proximity was a trap. He suggested letting her go, knowing with absolute certainty she would refuse. The Stockholm Syndrome performed flawlessly here. Luca rejected her own salvation, declaring she would never leave. She interpreted his coercive manipulation as profound affection, eagerly embracing the danger. This is the tragic paradox of captivity. The victim will inevitably fight to defend the very chains that bind them. This role inversion is a fascinating study in behavioral pathology. Luca took his face in her hands, offering comfort to the architect of her terror. Her declaration of love, despite his violent world, completely solidified the trauma bond. Vittorio's response, kissing her with desperate ownership, was an act of territorial dominance. He confessed his love was terrifying, shifting the narrative so she became the overwhelming force. He commanded her not to push him away, projecting his own control issues. As the rain continued, she probed into his childhood. She desperately sought the vulnerable human beneath the kingpin exterior. This is a classic cognitive mechanism victims use to humanize their captors and rationalize their compliance. Vittorio's recount of his childhood served a highly specific manipulative purpose. By detailing a violent father and absent mother, he provided Luca the psychological justification she needed for his atrocities. He framed his criminal empire as a necessary defense mechanism against weakness, softly claiming that Luca made him weak, that she made him desire normalcy, was a masterclass in emotional coercion. He positioned her as the singular, pure element in his corrupted existence. Luca's response was entirely predictable. She validated his twisted worldview, suggesting his violent reality was wrong, not his obsession. When she reminisced about her simple childhood dreams of adventure, she was actively romanticizing the psychological nightmare she was currently trapped inside. Luca's belief that her dangerous reality was better simply because Vittorio was in it marks a complete cognitive collapse. Calling himself a monster who found an angel, the kingpin used a classic dichotomy to bind her morality to his darkness. He offered a superficial warning about his terrible deeds, providing the illusion of informed consent. Predictably, her trauma bond compelled her to silence him. She chose willful ignorance, ignoring his violent past. There is a vital truth here. We often seek safety in the very fires that burn us, tragically mistaking the heat for warmth. As dawn broke, they lay tangled together in the quiet house. It was an artificial bubble of safety, constructed entirely from dangerous delusion and profound psychological dependency. Let's examine the timing of this proposal. You and I can see the calculated precision. As the storm faded, Vittorio demanded a permanent commitment. He asked her to step into his violent life publicly. This was the final stage of coercive assimilation. Presenting calculated vulnerability, he asked her to promise herself to him forever. Luca, completely submerged in her survival mechanism, agreed without a second of hesitation. She said yes to the isolation, the violence, and the permanent erasure of her former identity. The joy on Vitorico's face was the satisfaction of a predator who had finally secured the lock on the cage. His vow to never let her go was framed as a romantic promise, but clinically, it was an absolute life sentence. The transition back to the main estate marks a critical psychological shift. Vittorio seamlessly rebranded his fortified mansion as their shared home. By declaring his empire was now hers, he was not offering equality, but cementing her complicity. To a megalomaniac narcissist, absorbing a partner requires granting a false sense of ownership. Luca interpreted this as a profound display of trust, eagerly taking his hand to face the criminal underworld. Returning to the compound, the reality of her new life was visually inescapable. The property had become a heavily armed fortress. When she questioned the excessive guards, Vittorio immediately reinforced his absolute possession. He firmly reminded his captive that this extreme, paranoid overprotection was exclusively for her benefit. The impending negotiation with the rival syndicate catalyzed Vittorio's ultimate display of power. He calmly explained his terms. Either they leave Luca alone, or he would annihilate their entire bloodline. This casual homicidal threat highlights his antisocial pathology. When Vittorio tried to confine Luca upstairs, the illusion of her agency clashed with his rigid control. She refused to hide, adopting his language and asserting her place in his violent world. She rationalized that as the subject of the meeting, she had to be present, rejecting the role of the helpless damsel. She demanded to witness the brutal mechanics of the criminal life she had just embraced. Her psychological descent into his darkness was no longer forced. It had become entirely, tragically voluntary. Vittorio's concession came with degrading parameters. Luca was ordered to stay behind him, remain silent, and obey any dismissal. This micromanagement of her body re-established his dominance. The dark humor they shared over his stress levels served as a sickening normalization of their lethal reality. When the rival family arrived, the clinical psychopathy in the room was palpable. These were men devoid of empathy, comfortable with extreme violence. Antonio immediately targeted Luca. Calling her Vittorio's pet was a calculated psychological provocation designed to test the kingpin's emotional stability. Antonio's predatory smile and cold assessment of her appearance were textbook intimidation tactics. The calculated insult instantly triggered Vittorio's deepest territorial aggression. We have reached the final escalation. Stick with me, as this illustrates the narcissist's transformation. Vittorio did not defend Luca as an equal, but as his exclusive property. His icy declaration of absolute ownership was terrifying. Antonio identified Vittorio's emotional attachment as a fatal vulnerability, asserting that love makes men weak. Vittorio's chilling rebuttal remains a haunting psychological confession. He declared that love made him dangerous because he finally had something worth burning the world for. This is the ultimate danger of the megalomaniac narcissist. They never experienced love as a cure for their violence. Instead, they weaponize it. They use their twisted, obsessive devotion as the ultimate justification to destroy absolutely everything in their path. Let us examine this first interaction closely together. Cole sits across from his rival, his expression entirely dead. He offers a choice that is no choice at all. Agree to his terms or face total war. Antonio laughs, but he capitulates. The young woman is declared untouchable, codified in a contract. In exchange, Cole hands over half the South Docks after a brief tense negotiation, along with a 60-40 split of the casino revenue. The papers are drawn up on the spot. Antonio notes how eager Cole is to protect his asset. Cole pulls her closer, a physical claim of territory. She is now shielded by two criminal syndicates. The simple truth of human nature here is that powerful men do not protect people, they protect their possessions. Antonio nods slowly, sealing the pact. The moment the rivals leave the room, the young woman finally exhales. She believes the immediate threat is over, ignorant of the deeper psychological cage closing around her. Cole pulls her into his arms, whispering that she is under the protection of both families now. She asks why he surrendered so much territory for her. His answer is textbook narcissism. He tells her she is his entire future, that he would gladly burn his criminal empire to the ground to keep her safe. She labels this intensity as love. She even jokes that it is obsessive, possessive, and unhealthy by normal standards. It is a haunting rationalization. Sometimes, the most dangerous lies we tell are the ones we tell ourselves just to feel safe. He laughs at her observation, a warm and seemingly genuine sound. That evening, Cole gathers his inner circle for a dinner announcement. Bianca, Nate, Marco, and the key staff listen as he dictates his new reality. The woman is no longer just an employee. She is elevated to family. He takes her hand in front of the syndicate, declaring that anyone who disrespects her will answer directly to him. The murmurs of agreement ripple through the room. Bianca smiles, asking when he will make it official. The young woman is confused by the term. Cole strokes her knuckles, clinically explaining that it means she belongs to him publicly. He intends to put a ring on her finger soon. The lesson is clear. Absolute control often disguises itself as commitment. You and I need to pause and look at her rapid cognitive decline here. Her heart races at the mention of a ring. Later, in what is now their shared bedroom, she finally attempts to process the shift. She whispers against his chest that this is pure insanity. 3 months prior, she was a waitress in Riverside. Now, she is tethered to a cartel boss. He quickly corrects her vocabulary. He refuses the term girlfriend, opting instead for partner in life. He tilts her face upward, controlling her physical focus. He admits the life is dangerous and complicated, but insists his love outweighs the terror. She kisses him softly, accepting the madness. It is a perfect demonstration of how quickly the human mind normalizes extreme trauma when starved for affection. He demands to know if she is absolutely sure, warning her that his world does not allow for breakups. It only allows for forever. She agrees without hesitation. He smiles brilliantly, forcing her to repeat the word forever. He leans in, delivering a kiss that feels deep and full of unspoken contracts. He whispers that he loves her more than he thought possible. She replies that she loves him too, even when he is being overly protective and intensely suffocating. He grins, claiming that his obsession is just his true personality. 2 weeks pass in this isolated bubble. Then, one morning, she is in the kitchen making coffee when she notices a heavy weight on her left hand. We often ignore the loudest warning signs when they are disguised as romance. It is a ring, a simple, elegant, single diamond catching the morning light. She spins around to find Cole leaning in the doorway, watching her with a clinical, unreadable expression. He placed the jewelry on her finger while she was unconscious. This is a severe violation of bodily autonomy, yet he frames it as overwhelming passion. He tells her he simply could not wait any longer. He steps closer and officially asks her to marry him. She points out he already made the decision for her. He admits this, but demands to hear her verbal surrender. Her eyes fill with tears. She calls him completely insane, then joyfully says yes. She throws herself at him. The painful reality is that victims of profound manipulation will eventually thank their captor for the chains. Come with me as we fast forward 6 months to the wedding. They pledged there forever in the morning light, and she fully rationalized her entrapment. She told herself this was not the adventure she planned, but it was superior because it belonged to them. Now, it is an intimate gathering of loyal enforcers and family. She wears a simple white dress. Cole is in a dark suit, embodying the classic savior and destroyer archetype. Bianca adjusts the bridal veil, asking if she is nervous. When the bride admits she is terrified, Bianca praises the fear. The enabler spins a dangerous narrative, claiming the young woman has somehow cured the psychopath. But a leopard does not change its spots. It merely learns how to blend into the garden. Bianca steps back, reinforcing the delusion. She insists that a pure, innocent woman is the exact remedy for a violent syndicate leader. She claims the boss will protect this purity with everything he possesses. The ceremony itself is brief. They exchange traditional vows and simple promises. When Cole slides the wedding band onto her finger, his voice fractures perfectly. He plays the role of the damaged man, trying to heal. He looks into her eyes and confesses that he struggles with vulnerable feelings, but she makes him want to be a better person. He promises to spend the rest of his days protecting her and proving his worth. Her own voice thickens with emotion as she validates him. We must remember that predators are often phenomenal actors when the curtain rises. She tells him he is everything she never knew she needed. It is a textbook trauma bond response. His smile is soft as he echoes the sentiment back to her. They kiss to seal the contract, and the small crowd of dangerous men erupts into applause. The reception takes place in the heavily guarded gardens of the estate. There are bright lights, loud music, and flowing champagne. Cole refuses to release her hand for the entire evening. She teases him, warning that people will think he is excessively clingy. He dismisses the concern entirely. She is his wife now, his legal property, and he claims the right to hold her. He pulls her close for a slow, intimate dance, isolating her even in a crowd. True isolation does not require an empty room, just a blinded perspective. Stick with me here, because you and I need to look at how he maps out her entire existence. He whispers against her hair that he plans to keep her deliriously happy for the next 60 years. She laughs, bargaining for 80 later. As the violent guests depart, he finds her on the terrace. He announces they are leaving for a private island, 2 weeks with no guards and no business. When she questions the safety of having no security, he reveals he has hired a mercenary army to secure the perimeter. He promises she will be safe, but totally isolated from the world. He wants to wake up with her and consume her entirely without the distraction of his usual threats. A gilded cage is still a cage, no matter how beautiful the view is from the inside. He calls her by his last name, Mrs. Viscari, cementing her new identity. She eagerly accepts it, completely shedding her former self. As they drive away from the fortified mansion they call home, she takes one final look backward. 6 months ago, she arrived there as a desperate civilian looking for a minimum wage job. Now, her memory is completely rewritten. She views this highly dangerous, criminal environment as a perfect, flawless life. Cole asks what she is thinking about. She recalls the night they met, how she accidentally stumbled into his room in a nightgown and fell in love with Chicago's most lethal predator. His laugh is rich and full, declaring it the best accident of his life. We naturally crave safety so much that we will build our homes inside a burning building. She agrees, promising him her absolute devotion. He offers a wicked smile, warning her that if she ever enters his room like that again, he will not be held responsible for his actions. It is a final, subtle threat masked as romantic banter. They exchange their promises as the car carries them away. As they drive toward their shared fate, she reaches a haunting internal conclusion. She decides that some rules are meant to be broken, especially the ones about falling in love with a violent superior. And here we see the ultimate success of the psychological capture. She has surrendered her morals, her safety, and her mind. The saddest truth of human behavior is that once you fall in love with the dark, you will forever close your eyes to the light. This story is a dramatic romance about Grace Moore, a small-town woman who enters Cole Viscari's dangerous world because she needs money to support her family. What begins as a simple live-in housekeeping job becomes a life-changing journey into love, fear, loyalty, and personal choice. Beneath the romance and danger, the story carries several meaningful lessons about vulnerability, boundaries, and the cost of loving someone powerful. The first lesson is that desperation can push people into unfamiliar and risky situations. Grace accepts the job because her mother has medical bills and her family needs help. She does not fully understand the world she is entering. This reminds us that financial pressure can make people vulnerable. When someone is struggling, they may accept opportunities that look promising without fully understanding the hidden risks. The educational message here is simple. When making life-changing decisions, especially under pressure, we must ask questions, observe carefully, and protect ourselves. Another important lesson is about boundaries. From the beginning, Cole and Grace's relationship crosses professional lines. He is her employer, and she is a staff member in his home. Their attraction is intense, but the power imbalance is real. The story romanticizes this tension, but it also teaches viewers to think critically. In real life, relationships involving unequal power require honesty, consent, and caution. Feelings may be genuine, but both people must make sure no one is being pressured, controlled, or trapped by circumstance. Cole's protectiveness is another major theme. He wants to keep Grace safe from rival families, threats, and the violent world around him. His love is passionate and absolute, but it is also possessive. This creates a valuable lesson. Protection can feel comforting, but it must not erase freedom. Grace eventually insists on making her own choices. She does not want to be treated like a prisoner or hidden away while men decide her future. That is important because real love should empower, not silence. The story also shows that love can change people, but it should not be used as a fantasy cure. Cole becomes softer and more human through Grace. He wants to be better for her. That is beautiful, but change must come from genuine responsibility, not only romantic emotion. A dangerous person does not become safe simply because they love someone. Trust must be built through actions, respect, and consistency. For viewers, the deepest lesson is about choosing with open eyes. Grace knows Cole's world is dangerous. She sees the risks, the rules, the threats, and the cost of being with him. Yet she chooses him consciously. Whether the viewer sees this as romantic or risky, the educational point remains. Every relationship has consequences. Real commitment means understanding those consequences before saying yes. In the end, Grace's story teaches that love is not only about passion. It is about choice, courage, boundaries, and responsibility. A meaningful relationship should make both people feel valued, protected, and respected, not owned.